In order to manage expectations, so I'm a historian, I'm not a sociologist. And this is the background of my talk today. I'm reading Norbert Elias through the lens of historical research. And so my aim is not theory building, but to look for ways to build bridges between theory and practice, theory and context, theory and empirical research. So just so that you know. No. That's oh. No, I want to start with this one because I think you all recognize Norbert Elias. This is my favorite photograph of him. He has a sense of humor. And this is approximately the age he was when he published the book that's at the core of my presentation today, The Loneliness of the Dying in English. It was published first as an essay in 1979 in the journal Werk und Zeit, and appeared 3 years later as an independent short book. The following year, Elias gave a talk at a conference of the West German Medical Association, where he reflected more specifically on the questions of the sociology of the aging process. And that talk was published in English as part of the English translation of The Loneliness of Dying. The German original of the talk then became part of the subsequent German editions. The evolving publication history of the text shows that this was a topic that deeply concerned him in the early 1980s. So this is a project that evolved over time, but roughly between 1979 and 1982. Turning 85 in the year of the first publication, this had no doubt a personal background for him. But this was also a particular moment in the humanities when humanities turned to the topic of death and dying, looking for new perspectives. While Elias was working on the first version of his book, Hungarian photographer Péter Timár was just finishing his photo series, Grief. Timár spent 3 years in the largest communal cemetery in Budapest, documenting the lives of dead bodies and the lives of those who accompanied them on their last journey. Although he did not have a preconception of this work, as he said in an interview, Timár's documentation was based on a premise that nothing gave him a better insight into the deepest dynamics of society than documenting the ways it was treating its dead. The opening of the exhibition in 1983 turned into a political matter. The Central Committee of the Hungarian Communist Party shut it down and prohibited the distribution of the catalogue. The party argued that Timár's pictures, some of which showed naked dead bodies, would shock the general public. But I shall argue later that prohibiting the exhibition had another deeper meaning. So here we have a text, we have an exhibition, and I chose this photo from his series because I think it's a representative piece, but indeed there are shocking pieces in this series that I'm not going to show you today, but I very much, this exhibition is online. So if you're interested in this topic, you can Google him and you will find the exhibition catalog online that was banned in the beginning of the 1980s. So again, some of these images, some of his images are extremely shocking, but that I don't think that was the reason, or I'm pretty sure that was not the main reason alone for the prohibition. So the aim of my talk today is to connect these two pictures. How does Elias's theory help us to understand funeral practice in socialist countries? And what questions does the Marxist understanding of death, what I called Marxist Thanatology in the title that I proposed, and the real existing funeral practice in socialist countries, so what challenges do these pose for Elias's theory in return? And I don't know whether you've had a chance to read the abstract, but I formulated 2 questions. First, so how do Marxist efforts to create a new secular culture of the dead relate to, confirm, or challenge Elias's theory of tabooization? And the second one is, how can Elias's theory be applied to a political culture where ideologically determined power relations define the contours of the discourse on death and dying? And these two questions, they will be the red thread running through the entire presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, I will come back to them. So this is the structure of the talk. I think, just out of curiosity, how many of you have read the book? Do you? Oh, 50, that's good, 50-50, because I thought that, so I will start with a very, very short summary of his main thesis. And then I will start to contextualize this work, and then I will end up talking about Marxist Thanatology. So let's start with the book. So this book represents one of the most comprehensive analytical frameworks for conceptualizing death and dying in European societies. Based on his civilization theory, Elias considered the contemporary forms of dealing with death stage-specific. He uses this term, it's stage-specific, as a long-term result of the individualization process that had started already in the Renaissance, and as a result of the dissolution of social bonds, the internalization of societal taboos, the taming of the emotions in combination with the development of technology. Death and the dying process have lost their social aspect, this is what he argues, and had become individual and lonely affairs. As people increasingly lost contact with the realities of the dying process and also to dead bodies, they've also lost their ability to communicate about them. And you recognize the main themes of Elias's civilization theory: modernization, individualization, and so on. So he argued that 4 elements of modern life in particular, 4 elements of modern industrialized society, and this is always his frame of reference, changed fundamentally the attitude towards death. And these are the 4 factors. The fact that biological life is now longer, and thus it gives the illusion of control over, also over the process of dying. That the wealth of contemporary society strengthens the expectation of a natural death, which is actually a very modern thing. And connected to this also, that modern states effectively control the means of violence. So unnatural or violent death are not part of the collective experience anymore. This is what he argues. We can debate whether this is actually true, but this is a cornerstone of his theory. And then last but not least, the individualization of each aspect of everyday life, including coming up with answers to the ultimate questions of life and death. And I would like to quote a longer passage of chapter 7 to let Elias sum up, okay, how he understands what he considers the most important characteristics of yes. Oh, I'm sorry. You have to have very good eyes to be able to read this, but I will read. No, it's not mine. So I will read the text for you. So probably people on Zoom have a better view of this slide than we here in the room. So Elias writes, so this is his formulation. Religious death rituals can arouse in believers the feeling that people are personally concerned about them, which is doubtless their real function. Apart from these, dying is, at present, a largely unformed situation, a blank area on the social map. The secular rituals have been largely emptied of feeling and meaning. Traditional secular forms of expression lack the power to convince. Taboos prohibit any excessive form of strong feelings, although they may be present. And the traditional aura of mystery surrounding death, with the remnants of magical gestures, opening the windows, stopping the clocks, makes death less amenable to treatment as a human social problem that people have to solve with and for each other. At present, and so at present is always the beginning of the 1980s, at present, those close to the dying often lack the ability to give them support and comfort by proof of their affection and tenderness. Civilization's overgrown taboo on the expression of strong, spontaneous feelings ties their tongues and hands. and living people may half unconsciously feel death to be something contagious and threatening. They involuntarily draw back from the dying. I chose this excerpt because I think here all the main themes that he so beautifully develops over the other chapters, they come together here in a concise, comprehensive description. He also argues that death is not the only biosocial process that has undergone tabooization. His other example is sexuality, but he argues that sexuality, it was possible for sexuality to break out of these taboos, but death remains actually the last one, because death is looming and it's more threatening than sexuality. This is his argument. Importantly, and I think for my paper today that's key, he does not argue that the suppression of death is a new phenomenon. And suppression is such a bad translation, but there's no good word for, no good English word for Verdrängung. I mean, I think the German has better, has more connotations that are appropriate in this context, but the usual translation is suppression. So blocking out death, it's not a new phenomenon. That's what he argues. Also, in the past, there were shared myths that helped humans to cope with the knowledge that their existence was finite. So suppression has a long cultural history. But for Elias, what's important is that in the past, even this suppression itself had a social dimension. So that was a social act. So it's a very intelligent and revolutionary and extremely influential book, but it was also very much a book of its time. So why did he write this book? First, of course, well, there is definitely the personal dimension, but there was one catalyst that pushed him to write the book. I'm pretty sure that he was preparing for this for a while. And the catalyst was Philip Arias's pioneering cultural history of death in Europe. It's published, and Elias found the book so frustrating that he dedicated an entire chapter in The Loneliness of the Dying to its rebuttal, an entire chapter, and also a couple of chapters later, a very, very long footnote. Philip Elias, he described the state of the culture of death of his time. He starts his book also with the analysis of his present in very similar terms to Elias, actually. So the diagnosis is the same. But Arias draws stronger boundaries between the experience of death in the Middle Ages and the early modern period that he describes as the tamed death, the peaceful death, the beautiful death, and his present. And Elias was very irritated because, and I think actually rightly, because what he found awful was that Arias underestimated the importance of fear of death as an anthropological factor, also in the Middle Ages. And so Elias thought that was a huge shortcoming, and also more importantly for him, so that Arias didn't develop a theory based on his finding. So without a theoretical framework, and according to Elias, without the understanding of the stages of civilization, and I quote him, the enormous learning of Arias remained unstructured. So he respected this ginormous project, huge project, also very important in the historiography of death and dying, but he found it very lacking. So Elias, in his own writing, he wrote of stage-specific phenomena in the sense of his civilization theory, and not of system-specific phenomena. His frame of reference was industrialized society in general, so a question about the specificity of the socialist system did not play a significant role for him. In fact, it wouldn't have made sense for him, probably. That's not what he's interested in. And also in this regard, the book is interestingly very much a product of its time. Since the 1950s and 1960s, prominent economists, notably Jan Tinberger, have postulated that the planned economies of socialist countries and the free market of Western liberalism were already inextricably intertwined and were, in effect, converging. Convergence theory was heavily criticized by orthodox Marxists and hardliner liberals alike. But the theory also was extremely influential and soon left the realm of economics. In fact, by the early 1980s, one could speak of the emergence of cultural convergence theories that focused on contextualizing the development of socialist celebrations within broader contexts, such as the transformation of industrialized societies, the modernization theory, or the secularization theory. Cultural anthropologist Crystal Lane published the first comprehensive analysis of festivals and celebrations in the Soviet Union in 1981. And if you are interested in this topic, I'm pretty sure you've had this book in your hands. It's extremely good. It's very much worth reading even today, The Rights of Rulers. But what's interesting is that she placed her findings also within this broader context, comparing Soviet rituals in the end, so to the very last chapter. Okay, her conclusion is a huge contextualization. Ritual in Britain and the USA, ritual in post-colonial societies, ritual of the French Revolution, ritual in National Socialist Germany. So those are her reference points. So she's thinking along chronological lines, chronological traditions, but she's also thinking laterally. And for her, for Lane, I mean, it's in the title, obviously power structures were a key point of interest, but it's still telling that she was testing the limits of her findings, the limits of what she can make of the Soviet case, to what extent the cultural ritual, including funerals, reflected phenomena that had to do as much with processes of modernization, urbanization, industrialization, secularization, as with the specificities of the political system. So again, this book appears almost at the same moment as Elias's The Loneliness of the Dying. And while such an approach could be expected from a cultural anthropologist, so you could say, well, you know, they are thinking in big structures. Why is this surprising? We can find similar approaches even in such perhaps, even in more perhaps surprising academic disciplines. Clemens Richter, a professor for Catholic theology at the University of Münster, argued in several essays in the late 1970s and early 1980s that socialist rituals, especially such rites of passage as the funeral, were significant also for theology, because Catholic theology specifically, because they represented one possible form of ritual culture emerging from industrial society. So for him, and he's a Catholic theologian, it's a very different framework. And he says, well, it's very different, obviously, but what it shows is that even mankind, even in this industrial or post-industrial phase, still wants some kind of ritual structures. And actually, that's an asset that also theologians should try to access. And he writes, we do not know what significance these rituals have for the theology of liturgy, but they are significant. So there are a lot of good reasons, so all these examples, there are a lot of good reasons to consider the development of socialist funerals within broader European context. And in my previous work, I've argued exactly that. I mean, I've also argued along these lines. But today, I also argue that they have one specificity. And we get to this specificity is exactly if we read Elias. And that would be that they represent, I think, they represent the most ambitious, large-scale cultural experiment to derive a coherent ritual culture from ideological first principles. The 1950s and 1960s. I'm not passing, it's very important. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not passing any moral or qualitative judgment here. I'm not saying that socialist funerals work particularly well or poorly, because their efficacy lies solely in the eyes of the grieving community. And for some, they worked, for others, they didn't work. So there's no moral judgment here. I'm just observing and analyzing a phenomenon that I think also raises questions about the suppression of death. So, so at first sight, the vulgar Marxist understanding of religion confirmed Elias's thesis about the suppression of death. Marx himself has never written at length about death, and Ferdinand Reisinger argues that the few times Marx reflected about death at all in his writings, he was basically following Hegel and Feuerbach. The most famous Marx quotation, "Death seems to be a harsh victory of the species over the particular individual and to contradict its unity. But the particular individual is only of a particular species being, and as such, mortal." So what he's saying here is that, of course, everybody must die, but death is a victory only over the individual, not over society. And this is the quotation that everybody cites when they talk about Marx and death. And the topic of death appeared also in the early phase of state consolidation of socialist states, but in these Marxist discussions, mostly in relationship to religion, and specifically as part of a broader argument about the cultural and anthropological foundation of religion's grip on humanity. So to simplify, what we have, especially in the early 20th century, if Marxists talk about death, it's like, well, that is the explanation for the church's power over people. Okay? The church or Christianity promises defeat over death, and that's how they can blackmail people, basically. And in contrast, and that's actually the most important part, in contrast, Marxists always present themselves as representatives of life. Okay, religion is death, we are life. Religion is the past, we are looking to the future. But two developments in the late 1950s, however, placed questions regarding death in the center of Marxist discourse. So something changes. And these two are, the first is the Marxist-Christian dialogue, and the second is the new religious politics within the Soviet sphere of influence. And these two developments take place in different spheres, and it's very difficult to measure the extent to which they influence each other. And I'm happy to talk about this, the interactions between those two spheres in the question and answer session. But what's important for this talk or for this argument is that they both brought death out of the shadows. Okay, so that's already one point where we can think about Elias in a different way. So let's look at the Christian Marxist dialogue originating in the late 1950s. And the name, I use this term because everybody does, but it's extremely misleading because Christians and Marxists, they have been talking to each other, okay, also all through the first half of the 20th century and even before. But it denotes a loosely institutionalized form of exchange between Marxist philosophers, Catholic and Protestant theologians and scientists that took place in a series of conferences through the 1960s, organized first by the Paulus Society and the World Council of Churches afterwards. The aim of these meetings was not to convince the other side or to convert the other side, but to think about the smallest common denominators, the smallest common denominators, or to develop a common ground. And importantly, the dialogue brought together not only two ideal worldviews or ideologies, but also connected various branches of Marxist thought from both sides of the Iron Curtain. So it's really interesting that French Marxists start talking to Marxists from Czechoslovakia in a qualitatively new way, for example. The topics of the dialogue included technology, humanism, and also increasingly death and dying. And so I have this book cover on the slide because if you're interested in this at all, that's a wonderful book. And Reisinger put together a comprehensive catalog of publications on Marxist thought, of Marxist thought on death and dying, and quoted many publications that come out from this orbit. And although Reisinger did not come to this conclusion, I argue that based on the enormous body of literature generated by this experiment, that the effort to create a common ground of first principles served as a significant impulse to put death on the agenda as a challenge of contemporary societies in a qualitatively new way. Actually, one of my plans was just to put all the titles on one slide, and it would be really full, and that would give you an impression of just how much, I mean, the 1960s and the 70s. So if you read, every time I read in Elias, well, nobody talks about death. Of course, people are talking about death. They don't shut up about death. In the late 1960s and 70s, there's this huge discussion. Interestingly, most Marxist philosophers ended up focusing on an aspect of the dying process, and this is really interesting, that also interested Elias, grief. So not only just death as an ontological problem, as a philosophical problem, but specifically grief. To quote, and I just chose two more or less representative examples. So Branko Bošnjak, philosopher representing Yugoslavia at these conferences. So he writes at some point, in this book, he writes, humanity is a tragic species in the cosmos because it knows of its mortality. Philosophy explains this phenomenon, religion consoles. So up to this point, Elias would say, yes, of course. But then the person who transcends death on the basis of philosophy does not need religion anymore. That's a big jump. But that's the direction that a lot of Marxist philosophers go to. Let's take another one, and probably you are waiting for him because, of course, Ernst Bloch, the most emblematic figure of the dialogue, also came to similar conclusions, refining his original thesis since his early works. In The Heritage of Our Time, he writes, the enlightened life consciousness. I mean, this is also like a Marxist lingo in English translation is great. The enlightened life consciousness capitulates in front of death. The religious goes through it, but the Gordian knot is nowhere really solved in victory. So this is slightly different. He says, well, actually, we can't solve it. Religion can't solve it either. So it's basically death is the ultimate. It's not yet. That's his analytical category. So death is the ultimate unknown. Yet in the Principle of Hope, and that's why I have that on the slide, which is his main work. It's also a seminal work of the dialogue. He goes one step further and argued that class consciousness actually should serve as a solid basis to cut through this Gordian knot on the personal level. And he writes, the free spirit does not need any consolation, can go to his death with open eyes. He is the ideal type of the red hero, which sounds a little bit strange because we are at the end of the 1960s. And if you didn't know the context, you could say, well, this is Stalinism, right? The red hero goes to his death with open eyes. But so that's one outcome of this conversation. And in the next section, we shall see that the focus on personal transcendence corresponded in significant ways to cultural practice. So, because both of my examples, in the end, they focus on this personal level. But for this part of the talk, what's important to note is that the topic of death and dying becomes a battleground between. I mean, it becomes also a ground on which these two worldviews try to communicate to each other, but also where philosophical conflicts are fought. So what did the practice look like? And the late 1950s, and also this is happening at the same time as the Christian Marxist dialogue, but for completely different reasons, they represented a break in the relationship also of East German communist parties to death and dying. The political cult of the dead had played a central role in communist political culture since the Second World War, with lavish state funerals for war heroes and heroes of work serving as collective moments of catharsis. And of course, you see here Lenin lying in state, and Lenin's cadaver frozen in time translated the idea of permanent revolution into a permanent repository of collective grief. In a political culture based on the constant mobilization of the population, the concept of the ordinary citizen was difficult. And it was only after Stalin's death that communist parties, in the process of coming to terms with their own Stalinist past, started to consider funerals on a broad scale as politically relevant, symbolic acts and potential sources of cultural capital. As the unexpected demise of the father of peoples in March 1953 united the Soviet sphere of influence in a cathartic moment of collective grief, for some genuine, for others imposed, the critical assessment of his legacy posed fundamental questions about the role of ideology and marked the beginning of the process that made socialist rites of passage available for the general population as an element of the political ideological toolkit of state building. So up to this point, up to the mid-1950s, rites of passage had been left more or less in the purview of the churches, even in Czechoslovakia, where cemetery lands, uniquely in Eastern Europe, were nationalized already after the Second World War. No other East European country does that. Yep, they nationalize everything. But a broad-scale secular campaign for funerals for ordinary people in Czechoslovakia starts also in 1954. So the chronology works out. In the GDR and in Hungary, this year is 1958. And it's interesting, within a couple of weeks of each other, both parties launch a big campaign. So if up to 1958, citizens of these states had a choice between religious ritual and no ritual to commemorate death, starting in the late 1950s, they had a third option, a socialist funeral. And in the GDR, exceptions were urban centers such as Leipzig, where secular funerary tradition existed with roots in the interwar period. But now, what's new is that this option was now made available everywhere. And in both countries, the introduction of socialist rites of passage transposed the struggle between worldviews into the private sphere in new ways. And since my research focused on Germany, East Germany and Hungary, I'm going to use these two countries as an example, but that was also one of the reasons why I was so happy about the invitation. I really, really hope that you can tell me about the Polish case, because I don't know anything about the Polish case, and I'm very, very interested. So the background in both cases for the introduction of socialist funerals was historically specific. In Hungary, it was meant to prepare a large-scale campaign of collectivizing agriculture, and in the GDR, it resulted from a power struggle within the party in which Walter Ulbricht's hardliners secured their position through a campaign to promote secularism. In both countries, however, the result was that, and this is, we are turning back to Elias, and was that an intensive discussion emerged about the practice of funeral that led to the creation of new expert groups, whose job it was to actually think through this topic. For the propagation of socialist funerals on a large scale, established principles of state funerals had of limited use. In the GDR, the solution was to pretend that every biography was essentially a hero's life. One set of guidelines published by a cultural committee formulated 5 points that a eulogy should address. And here I just put, so there's a huge literature that comes out of this, and I just put you, that brought you some representative examples. So how do you translate the state funeral into everyday life? There was this 5-point plan. So the first point presented the foundation of the socialist funeral, and I'm quoting, "The death of a citizen of the GDR is a painful loss to all peasants and workers, because we appreciate every person as a part of the force that builds our socialism. So we grieve everyone equally." That's the translation. The speech should continue with a reverential overview of the life that has ended and describe the forces against which the deceased had to fight, including a condemnation of exploiters, militarists, and fascists. The basic tenor of the eulogy was struggle, which aligned the individual biography with key elements of the history of the state, be it the liberation through the Red Army, the fight against fascism, or the struggle of the international proletariat. And in the late 1950s, this part could be filled with actual biographical details from most people, some people. But in the following decades, it was often shortened to a series of formulaic statements about struggle in general. The next part of the speech was dedicated to the good deeds of the deceased in his family, in the circle of colleagues and friends, and the mass organizations. This point, even in this succinct formulation, offered a range of solutions to the dilemma of achievements. So every biography could be presented as a sum of contributions to the development of socialist society. So also if somebody was a good mother, that could be now presented as a contribution to building socialism. Although treated separately, the private and the public realms were intimately intertwined. A functioning family or good social relations within the immediate community had now political relevance. The last part of the eulogy is supposed to give solace and address, quote, the wound created at the workplace, at the office, in the family, and pronounce the pain felt over the loss of this person, quote, ends. With this last step, the transposition of the logic of state funerals at large was complete. Grieving was moved from the private to the social sphere. The consoling message of the speech was, yes, this was a life worth living. In Hungary, the same ideological premises were translated into almost identical rhetorical building blocks, but with two key differences. So the speeches sound very similar, but there are two key differences. First, the accent of the secular funeral lay on interjecting society into the private sphere in Hungary as well, but there it was through creating an effective community, not effective, but effective in terms of emotions. And I quote from this book, the book that you see there in the middle. It's one of the most widely used handbooks. Each eulogy has to reflect the materialist understanding of death, that is the natural consequence of life, that each living being has to die, and that we do not want to win otherworldly salvation for the deceased, but we want to express and deliver to the grieving family the condolence and sympathy of society, the warm human emotions of the community. The speech should console and encourage, because it cannot be its purpose to break down a grieving person even more. So do not stress the grieving family. It's very interesting that they actually think about that. The orator's purpose is not to try to diminish or deprecate the tragedy that hit the family, but he should not make the pain worse either. He should not try to make the grieving community cry like a priest. The eulogy should convince the family members that they must not completely give in to the pain. So the management of emotions stood front and center also in the GDR, but mostly in the sense of containment. We contain it. Hungarian manuals laid a heavier emphasis on the power of shared emotions. When the author of a guidebook on funerals took stock of the precedence of non-religious funerals, he concluded, funerals without a religious ceremony are cold, Puritan. The speeches have no personal character, and that's a problem. So we have to address that. The second difference to the GDR arose from the conceptualization of the new funeral culture. In the GDR, in the midst of the atheism campaign, there was a discussion about the exact purpose of funeral rites. Should they be specifically socialist or generally non-religious? While there was no consensus on this issue, the ideological message was meant to be strongly present because secular rites of passage were classified as a tool of class struggle. As Felix Robin Schulz has argued, the accents changed over time, however, as funeral professionals responded to the complexities of the actual demand, making a whole spectrum of secularity possible with more or less strong emphasis specifically on Marxist ideology. This development was neither supported nor hindered by state and parties, so by the 1980s, they basically just let it develop. And Schulz writes, Felix Robin Schulz writes about a categorical conflation between socialist and secular in the area of funerals, with the term weltlich or worldly appearing with increasing frequency as an umbrella term for all of them. In Hungary, in the context of the new church policy of the late 1950s that emphasized gradual change over time, the decision was made at the beginning to clearly distinguish between civil and socialist funerals. The civil funerals were meant to be different from religious ones, but also from socialist burials. So the author of this book, for example, he argues that be careful with the color red at the funeral. Don't overdo it because it will just alienate the people. So you can use the color red for someone who was really a communist, but for the rest, it's good enough if they don't go to the priest. We shouldn't be very ambitious. The difference between and I'm coming close to the conclusion, don't worry. So the difference between the two approaches could be best illustrated through the ways in which eulogies address the grievers. So I'm coming back to grief. In the GDR, the eulogy acknowledged the legitimacy of the feeling of loss, but also tried to effectively close the hole left by the deceased. Hungarian manuals, in contrast, proposed eulogies that emphasized society as a community of grievers that existed also after the funeral. This ambitious program did not mean that Hungarian orators fulfilled their role psychologically more effectively than their East German colleagues. That's not the case. In fact, sociological research of the 1980s showed that that was not necessarily the case. But both of them were grappling with the challenge of creating solace based on the ideas of historical materialism. And that's very difficult. And it's very difficult. In fact, in the 1980s, so very, very late, almost just before the Berlin Wall falls, an East German philosopher, Gerald Frankenhäuser, wrote a habilitation about Marxist thanatology. And he argued that the problem was not that Marxism was indifferent towards death and dying, but that historical materialism was not integrated into socialization enough. And I quote him, he says, "It seems important that long before death occurs, there is a clarity based on worldview about the question of death, so as to possibly reduce the anxiety and the insecurity caused by the seemingly unexpected event of dying." So Frankenhäuser's argument was, therefore, that Marxism had a clear answer to these problems, but that people didn't want to hear it. So to my conclusion, to return to Elias, so all these examples, in a macabre way, or in a strange, dark way, at the core of socialist funerals was an effort to write the social element back into the grieving process. In some ways, therefore, at least on paper, this was a project, this was a huge, ginormous project, was to address some of the problems that Elias recognized in the 1980s, the element of emotions, the social dimensions of death, what this all meant for the dying specifically. I can talk about this in the question and answer period. But adding the political context to Elias's theory opens up a new dimension that he doesn't talk about because it's not his focus, but I think which is very, very important altogether. And I call that the element of stakes, the element of stakes. The socialist creators of funerary culture were deeply aware that they were entering a territory where they had comparably little experience and that blunders would have consequences. And this worked in two ways. So, for example, in 1963, in East Germany, there was a funeral orator who said at the funeral, "The face of the relatives of our dear deceased are of a whiter shade of pale. Terrible fear grabs hold of them, but who knows the meaning of life?" That's what he says, because he sees that people are sad. And soon after the funeral, this orator, who was a member of the Communist Party, he faced the party disciplinary committee for spreading idealist philosophy, because the point was that if there was anyone who was supposed to know exactly the meaning of life, it was the communists. So you can't say who knows the meaning of life, even as a rhetorical tool. And so the socialist funerals was meant to be a celebration of life well lived, not a meditation about the fear of the inevitability of death. And what happens is that he actually, he's disciplined, he's punished, and he is not allowed to hold funerals anymore. They prohibit because they think, well, he's just not, he didn't get it. So that's one element, but the second element, and here we come back to this, to Timar and his photographs, but also because the state expanded, and this is true for all socialist states that engage in this, since the state expanded its control into every aspect of life, the problems of funerary culture were also directly related to a criticism of its shortcomings. And this is why Timar's photo series was considered so dangerous, because when he showed the unkindness and the cold indifference of real existing socialist funerary practice, The implication was that this is the culture that emerges on the established frame of socialist realism. And because the state injected itself into the grieving process, it also established a liability.